The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to this free webinar today for half an hour. Tim Baker's my name. I'm going to talk about the 5 pillars of authentic performance conversations, and as I go through this process, I'm going to talk about a few tips and hints that might be very useful for you in relation to having more authentic conversations. So welcome. You'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this, and I have a little bonus for you at the end, which I'll talk about as well. So enjoy, but if you've got any questions or comments or observations that you'd like to make throughout the presentation, if you go to the right-hand side, if you're unfamiliar with this process, you'll notice there's a little box there with questions on it. If you just open it up and type in your question, what will happen is that I'll get to see that question, no one else does, and of course I'll refer to it throughout the presentation. So don't wait to the end, because I'm not going to leave a 10-minute awkward silence while people thinking of the questions that they want to ask. Ask them straight away at the time, because that's the best time. It's fresh in your mind, it adds context, and of course it gets you involved in the session as well. All right, so let's get underway today. Oop, I just get that out. Okay. Oops. Okay. So we're going to cover 3 topics essentially in the short 30 minutes we've got. I'm going to talk about conversations generally at work and some of my observations on that. I'm going to obviously address the 5 pillars, because obviously that's what the whole session's about. And throughout doing that, I'm going to talk about some practical tools that you can use in terms of improving the authenticity of your conversations as such. All right, so let's get underway. Now, a few key comments about conversations which I think are worth making at this point. The first thing I'd like to say is that in one of my previous books, which I co-authored with Aubrey Warren, the book, of course, is called Conversations at Work. And in that book, we state that organisations are conversations. So if you actually think about it, there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, even millions, depending on the size of the organisation, conversations that are going on every day. Some of them go on in the lunchroom, some of them go on in the boardroom, some of them go on in the car park, some of them go on in the corridor. Some are long, some are short, some are interesting, some are not, and these conversations go on and on and on. And so you could actually argue that conversations, that organisations are really a series of conversations. And so therefore, if organisations are a series of conversations, then the key point there is, are those conversations quality conversations? And how can we improve the quality of those conversations as such? So that becomes the critical issue for us in organisations, that obviously there are tasks that need to be done, and there's relationships that need to be maintained. And it's the relationship aspect, or more particularly the conversation aspect, that I'm interested in. Of course, people talk about the art of conversation, and I really don't think there is an art form to conversation. I'm one of those people that don't believe it's an art. People often say the art of conversation. What I mean by that is that you and I are used to having regular conversations at home, at work, everywhere. We're reasonably well practiced at it. So the argument that we need to have, that it's some sort of an art form or some high skill set, is not necessarily true. I do believe that some difficult conversations, some of the courageous conversations that I'm sure we're all aware of, they do require a skill set. They do require a mindset as well. And I understand that they do take a little bit of getting used to. But I would say to you that generally speaking, most conversations are not an art form. And I think if we start believing that conversations, or the art of conversation, we use phrases like that, we may discourage ourselves from actually developing those conversation skills that we need. And the question, it does beg the question, have we lost the need for conversations? I mean, these days, of course, we can have conversations via email, and many of us do. These days, we can have conversation via text, and many of us do. And these days, we can have conversations through a whole series of social media, and many of us do. But I don't believe it means that we've lost the need to have conversations. In fact, I would actually argue the reverse. I think that it's actually more important now that we have conversations, and quality conversations, than it ever was before. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little later. I was talking to a manager the other day who was asking me for my advice. He had a turnover of about 25%, so 25% of his team would leave every year, which is too high in his industry. And he wanted me to make some suggestions about how that could be stopped. And I talked to him about conversations, and he basically said to me that he didn't have time, nor did anyone in his business have time to have conversations. And I was a little bit lost for words, which is unusual, some people would say at that point, because I said, "You mean you don't have any conversations?" He said, no, we have conversations. We have conversations about work. We have conversations about the tasks that need to be done. But we don't have those other type of conversations that you're suggesting, developmental performance conversations. And I said, well, perhaps there might be a linkage between that and the high turnover you've got. And anyway, he came around to my way of thinking, but I think it's interesting that some people see conversations as quite trivial and not related to the work that needs to be done, because at the end of the day, an organisation is just a series of people, isn't it, working towards a common cause. And if we think, and so therefore, it's the quality of those interactions that really make the difference. Two colleagues of mine in the United States, Jim Kuzner and Barry Posner, wrote a great book called Credibility some years ago. And in their very first chapter, they say, or they use the phrase, leadership is a relationship. And I thought it was a great phrase, that leadership is a relationship. So my rhetorical question to those two gentlemen was, how do we have a relationship with anybody? And there's only one real answer, and you probably all worked that out, that the answer is, of course, one conversation at a time. There is no other way of doing it. And so leadership is a relationship, but we can only have relationships if we're willing to have conversations. And of course, those conversations are ongoing, they never end. So there's a correlation between conversations and leadership as well, of course. All right, so that's just setting the scene and giving you some ideas of what I believe around the importance of conversations in the workplace. And I believe, as I said earlier, that it's more important now than it ever was before. Okay, so what I'll do now is I want to launch into talking about the conversation or the 5 pillars of authentic conversations, and talk a little bit around that for you. And I'll obviously share with you the pillars. And what I'll also do is I'll share with you some little tips and hints on how you might fulfill each of those 5 pillars. So the pillars, as you can see, it's set up where, of course, the pillars are the foundation. And if we get that wrong, obviously our conversations aren't going to be as effective as they could be. So let's have a look at the first pillar. So the first pillar in the actual framework, if you like, is the pillar of agreeing on expectations. Now, I think as leaders, we often think we have agreed on expectations, but we haven't really. It's actually quite a complex topic, but just because you have mentioned your expectations at a meeting, or you've talk to people about it one-on-one in a corridor, or having a corridor conversation, doesn't necessarily mean that there's an agreement on expectations. Let me show you what I mean by that. There are actually 7 questions around managing expectations, and I'll run through them fairly quickly because of the time. But I want you to have a think about yourself when I run through these questions and think, well, am I actually doing that or not doing that? Here they are. Question number 1 is, what are my expectations? So if I haven't got clear expectations in my head, that's obviously not a good starting point, right? So I need to be very clear about what I'm expecting of other people and of myself as well, of course. And once I have been clear about what I expect, the next key question is, have I communicated my expectations to those people that I need to communicate to? So I might communicate in a team meeting, I might communicate one-on-one in a corridor, I might actually send people an email. So the question is, have I communicated? And of course, what this means is that it's not just a one-off. We need to do it on a regular basis in different ways, in different formats. So the next key question, once we have answered that, is does the other person actually understand my expectations? That's one thing, having them communicated, but it's another thing, do they actually understand? And I think this is something, of course, people don't often say to you, I don't understand what you're getting at. You know, they just normally walk away in a bit of a they're not quite sure, but they're not letting you know that they're not quite sure. So this is where it can be quite deceptive. People need to understand the expectations. The next question that needs to be answered is, do they accept your expectations? Now, you know, it's one thing understanding it, but it's another thing actually accepting it. And of course, you see this when people set people budgets, particularly in a sales environment. The budgets are usually beyond the pale. They're just, ridiculous. And of course, the salesperson on the end of that knows that, and they don't accept the budget, and they don't accept the actual sales target. And of course, they underperform as a result of that. So we see that all the time. Now, just because somebody accepts the expectation doesn't mean we're home and hosed, because the next key question is, are they committed to meeting those expectations? Now, this is very important because it's one thing to accept it, but it's another thing to commit to it. Now, for most of us are very busy. We've got 10 things on the go, 10 balls in the air we're juggling at one time. And because we're juggling all of those balls, your expectation or what you want people to do may not necessarily be high on the list of priorities. And so therefore they aren't that committed to achieving it. So we've actually got to look people in the eye in our conversations and actually say to people, can I get your commitment on this to get this report written by the close of business today? It is important. Now, if you do that, it's not being disrespectful. You're looking for a nod or a grunt or a yes. And if you get a nod or a grunt or a yes, it basically means that they've basically committed to your expectation. Whether they follow through or not is another question, but at least they've made a verbal or a non-verbal commitment to you that they will achieve what you want them to achieve. The next key question then, of course, is, do people know how they're performing against expectations? And this is about feedback. This is about giving people regular, ongoing, moment by moment, situation by situation feedback. And it's really important that leaders do this. Now, if you're giving people feedback, then of course they understand how they're traveling against your expectations. But that's not the end. There is another question, a final question, and that is this: are you supporting them to meet those expectations? Now, this could be coaching, it could be removing organisational barriers, it could be a whole range of things that you could be doing to help them meet those expectations. So look, I really wanted to say to you that it's quite a complex topic around that. So when I say pillar 1, setting expectations, it's not quite so simple as just blurting out something that you want done, and that's the end of that. So pillar number 2 in this particular framework is challenging unhelpful behaviour. Now, one thing you'll notice on this is down the bottom, these two, pillars 1 and 2, are task focused. You could probably guess that the next 3 are going to be relationship focused. So we've got to challenge unhelpful behaviour, and here's a way of doing it that's very effective. Just a simple tool that you can use. I call it the SBI model. It's not mine. I've taken it from somewhere else, but I think it's brilliant. So when you're giving somebody feedback, in other words, you're having to approach them about unhelpful behaviour, you explain, you talk about the situation, so that's the context. You indicate the behaviour which needs to change or is unhelpful, and you talk about the impact of that on yourself or other people. So, for example, you might say something like this: our regular Monday morning staff meeting are for sharing ideas and problem solving. That's my first sentence that I've said to somebody. So what I've done is I've actually set the context. That's the situation. So in other words, what I'm referring to, of course, is our staff meetings that are held regularly on a Monday. Now, I'm going to say something else about that. I'm going to say that in the last 3 meetings, I've noticed that you have criticised 4 suggestions that Matthew and Karen have raised without offering any possible alternative solution. All right, so I've in a very clear, succinct way have explained the behaviour that I believe is unhelpful. All right, now that person may well have a good reason for, shooting down Matthew and Karen and so forth, but nevertheless, I've set the scene. And then my final one is very important, it's often underestimated, is the impact of that. So I'm going to say this: by doing this, you're affecting morale and others may not want to contribute their ideas in future. You see how that's done? So that is the way of getting it across. Here's the situation, here's your behaviour, and basically this is the impact of that on me or other people in the office. So try the SBI model, it's wonderful. Now, pillar number 3. Now, so far we've looked at expectations. We've actually looked at challenging unhelpful behaviour using the SBI model. Now, pillar number 3 is establishing a trusting relationship. Now these are events. These are important pillars in any meaningful development or performance conversation, or any conversation for that matter. And all of these things should at some stage be present in the conversation in order to be effective. So how do you establish a trusting relationship with someone? Well, let's have a look. At the end of the day, there's lots and lots and lots of things written about, trust and how you build it and so forth, and a lot of it is very worthwhile. But at the end of the day, I've distilled it down to 4 key things. If you take all the research and if you look at all the interesting articles and journals and books on this subject, there's basically 4 key things that will affect the trust levels between you and other people. One is how you treat people in terms of fairness. So people will sit there and they will see you treating them and compare that treatment to how other people have been treated by you. And of course, if there's a perception that they're being treated unfairly, then obviously the trust level goes down. So leaders have not only got to be fair, but they've got to be seen to be fair, because people's antennae are up and they really do recognise when people aren't being when they're not necessarily being treated fair. So that's an important part of it, of course. Recognising their positive contributions. Now, if you recognise and acknowledge people's positive contributions, you will find, interestingly enough, and you do it in an authentic way, of course, not just for the sake of technique or getting a result. If you do that in an authentic way, it actually does increase trust, interestingly enough. Right. Giving people clear direction. People want certainty, people want psychological safety. So a leader is about certainty and psychological safety. And one of the best ways of doing that, of course, is to be absolutely crystal clear about what you expect of other people, and to be absolutely clear about, your expectations and what you want done. Now, if you do that well, you'll find that people will feel comfortable. But if you're very ambiguous and you're not quite sure, or you change your mind regularly, you'll find that people will will not find that very helpful, and as a result of that, trust levels drop off. And they also want your support, particularly if it's support around learning and development as well. So look, there's 4 simple things that a lot of us don't do regularly that can make a huge difference in terms of winning over people's trust level. Okay, moving right along now. If we get to pillar number 4, pillar number 4 is around showing genuine appreciation. Now, I put the word in there, genuine, because I think in lots of cases this can be manufactured, and people aren't silly, they can pick it up a mile off. But actually showing a genuine appreciation for people requires, it's a lot harder than it sounds. It's not just a compliment here and there. It's not that easy to do. So in a conversation, it would be important to focus on some of those things that you appreciate, but either in the argument or in what the person themselves actually has to say. So there are some ways of doing that, and because of the fact that this is only a very short webinar, I'm only going to give you a couple of tips. I would say, at the end of the day, the simplest, most powerful way for you to show your appreciation of other people is simply using one word: thanks or thank you. And I think it's fair to say that we're living in a society now where, and maybe it's always been the case, I can only talk for how long I've been here on planet Earth, but I would probably think that there is a shortage of thank yous in the workplace. Now, this is not old-fashioned nonsense, because it's really about actually genuinely appreciating where people are coming from. Thanks for finishing the report this afternoon, knowing full well you had lots of other things on your plate. Thanks for staying back the extra couple of hours this evening to help me finish that project. Thanks for dealing with that irate customer the way you did. It was impressive. Thanks for speaking up at this morning's meeting. It really needed to be said. Thank you. These things should be part of the fabric of your conversations with people. And if someone's frank with you in a conversation, for example, then say thank you. Thanks for being so open and honest. Okay, so I think we're just going to look for those opportunities, because if we do that, we find ourselves in a far stronger position to be able to be authentic. Does anyone have any questions, observations, or comments at this stage that they'd like to ask me? Because go for your life. It's now, I won't say it's now or never, but you can certainly try now. It would be well worth your while if you've got something you want to say. So I don't think anyone will actually accuse you of thanking them too much. It's not realistic for that. As long as it's done in a genuine way, people will appreciate it. So that's a simple thing that you can do in your conversations that will make a major difference, which will take no time and no great effort. Simple thing. Okay, so let's get to pillar number 5. So in pillar number 5, in these conversations that we're having with people, pillar number 5 is about building for the future. So it's really about, the only reason that you would have a conversation with someone in relation to development or performance, for example, is because you want to make sure that either their positive behaviour is continued and maintained, or on the other hand, that the behaviour is actually changed. That is, it's unhelpful, and because of that, it needs to change. So there's only one of two things basically that that you're trying to do in a conversation that's around people's performance or development. And you'll notice now along the bottom, we've now got the people focus. So we've got task focus and people focus, and I've balanced those up. So 3 people, 2 tasks. So let's spend a moment or two looking at our last pillar there on the development of future, and then we'll wrap up. And if you've got any comments or questions, I'm more than happy for you to type them in, and I'll certainly respond to them. Okay, So I think, and I'm sure this is adapted from somewhere, but I think the whole great meaning of life is to learn from the past, because you keep making the same mistakes if you don't. Live in the moment, which is what modern day is called mindfulness, and plan for the future. And it's a nice little way of actually organising your life. But we do know that from research that 70% of the time that people spend is actually not in the moment. Pretty staggering, isn't it? So 70% of the time we're thinking about what we had for breakfast, what we're going to have for dinner. We're thinking about, how I'm feeling. We're thinking about last night's Netflix movie. We're thinking about, why did that person speak to me the way they did this morning? Doing all that while we're living in the moment. And of course, but my point about this last pillar is that what you need to do is focus on the future. So it's no point spending too much time, arguing about the past and she said this and he said that. No point, because at the end of the day, all you're trying to do is to set up behaviour modification for the future. So it's really looking at changes that are required for the future that become quite critical. All right, so these are the 5 pillars, and of course, if you keep them in top of mind when you're having these conversations with people, there's a very good chance that your conversations will be even more effective than they currently are. And it's always a work in progress. And as I said at the outset, some of us have great conversations, some of us have terrible conversations, some are long, some are short, some are meandering, some are straight to the point. They go on everywhere. And if you think about it, organisations are indeed conversations. So if there's no questions or comments, I will move on, if I may. And I just wanted to give a quick bit of information for you that you might find useful. I have a program called Lunch and Learn. And Lunch and Learn is an online, it's like you're doing now, but basically working with me for six 1-hour sessions over a period of time. We normally get an audience in the room, as we've got today. We've got something like 45 to 50 people registered, and you have a topic for each of those sessions. And you can see on the the left-hand side, many of those, those 6 topics. So we've got 6 modules. And you are more than welcome to register for the next one, which is next Friday. Not today, but 1 week from today. So we'd love to have you on board. And as a little special incentive to get you to come on board, as of today, I'm offering you a 10% discount if you register today. And a registration is just sending me an email to let me know that you want to register. So if you do that by the close of business today, it's 10%, so it's $295 GST inclusive minus 10%. Okay, so that's the deal for today. All you've got to do is just shoot me an email in my inbox, and that's fine. And you can register either via me sending you an invoice, or you can do that online if you choose. And what we'll be covering is a lot of these conversations that we've been talking about, and it'll give you some real opportunity to look at this in more depth, because obviously today was just a quick half-an-hour session for everybody as such. So more than happy to have you on board with that. So folks, that's pretty much it from me. I just want to make sure that there are no questions. Not likely. Okay, good. So that's it from me. So shoot me an email if you're interested in registering. If you've got any questions or any comments that you'd like to make that you perhaps haven't done so, then just send me an email and I'm more than happy to answer that. So thanks for tuning in, folks. You can go onto my website and there's a whole bunch of other free webinars there as well. So have a wonderful weekend, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you and goodbye.